Cold War, Origins and Overview. Just wanted to give you guys a real quick presentation on the overview of why the Cold War happened, what it was, when it happened, where it happened. You need to take notes as you go through. There'll be a short quiz on this, and you also need to be prepared to give me the 5 W's, the who, what, the where, the when, the why for the Cold War. Now, going through this, I put some Wikipedia links in there. This is basically just overview, encyclopedia level stuff, so don't feel like we're going into depth. I just want to give you some idea of what we're talking about so that when we go through some of the primary source documents, you have an idea of what's going on. So we want to look back at how did we get in the situation we got in with the Cold War, and that really starts before World War II and before our alliance with Russia and Stalin. So when the Bolshevik Revolution happens in 1917, back during World War I, that's the origins of communism in the Soviet Union. And if you remember when we talked about World War I, the United States does not trust the Soviet Union at all. We don't trust communist ideology. So in 1917 is when the strained relationship really starts. We have the first American Red Scare that we talked about in class earlier in the year, where we are afraid of communism and anyone that's communist, and we try and get rid of them, and we change a bunch of laws. And that goes into us not trusting Stalin and the communists later. Adding to that fact, he was aligned with Hitler at the beginning of World War II, makes us trust him even less. And the wiki link down there at the bottom, the quote that really sums this up pretty well, or the phrase, is the friend, or the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's how we look at Stalin. We don't like him per se. We don't like what he stands for. We don't trust him at all. We just know that we need him to fight against Hitler. Otherwise, we're in big trouble, and we might not be able to win. So we are only friends with him because he is fighting against Hitler. And so when you think about that, that makes a lot of sense, that during World War II, even though we're on the same side, we don't trust each other. The Western leaders, FDR for the U.S. and Churchill for Britain, don't trust Stalin, and Stalin doesn't trust us. So we have some specific concerns as far as trusting him as a person and him being kind of an evil, manipulative, willing to kill anyone dictator. We thought the Soviet Union would try to spread communism throughout Europe, and we didn't want that to happen because, remember, we're afraid of that ideology spreading throughout the world. And we were also very concerned that the Soviet Union would occupy and take over Eastern Europe and possibly all of Europe. The Soviet concerns were, again, the trust issue. They thought the U.S. would try and spread capitalism, so they have the same fears we do, just on the other side. They thought Stalin believed the U.S. delayed entry into the war, specifically believed that we didn't open up a Western front, and we didn't invade France. We delayed that just to try and hurt the Soviets and weaken them. He also, later in the war, doesn't trust us because we don't tell him about the atomic bomb. He had spies in the United States, so he knew that we were developing the atomic bomb, but we never told him about it. So usually in an alliance, you would tell everybody what was going on and everybody would know, but that trust never exists. So that trust that goes through the war is kind of an uneasy thing. We need to have these two sides need to work together to defeat the Nazis, and so we work on that. But where the distrust really comes through is in the post-war planning. And I want to specifically talk about the Yalta Conference and the Potsdam Conference, which you've already heard in your hippocampus videos. You've already seen those, but just to kind of go back through that. February 4th through 11th in 1945, the U.S., Britain, and Russia get together to try and decide what are we going to do after the war. The war is not over, but it's pretty obvious it's going to be soon. The U.S. is quickly moving into Germany from the west, and the Russians are quickly moving into Germany from the east, and it's just a matter of time. So the big three get together to discuss some things. The main points they take out of this is the unconditional surrender of Germany. They were going to demand that. There's no German surrender other than you quit and you don't get anything. The Soviet Union agrees in principle to the war against Japan after the defeat of Germany. Remember, right now the Soviets are not fighting the Japanese. They also agree that post-war Germany will be divided into 4 zones. And we'll talk more about that later, but basically they're going to split up Germany between Britain, France, United States, and Russia. And they also agree that Poland will become more democratic. Notice how that's in quotes. Poland is basically communist at this point, which the Soviet Union is occupying. The U.S. doesn't want that to stay communist, but the Soviets basically see Poland as non-negotiable, because every time that Germany has invaded Russia, World War I or World War II, they go through Poland, and Stalin basically says this is not happening anymore. And so the agreement was that they would become more democratic, whatever that meant. Potsdam Conference, after the German surrender, it's actually held in Germany. Germany could be called the Berlin Conference as well. Basically, here they're trying to decide a new world order, who's going to be in charge of what's this thing going to look like. They're going to try and decide where the peace treaties are going to be, what countries are going to be at peace, and they want post-war reconstruction. So they agree on a couple of things. We're still at war with the Japanese, so that's an important discussion. The Soviets haven't joined yet. But the main points you take out of Potsdam is that we're going to split Vietnam between North and South, basically communists and non-communists, and that's just because it was easier at that point. They're going to help the USSR economy. So the Soviets actually move a lot of the heavy industry out of Germany, literally pick the factory equipment up and move it into Russia. And that's designed to make up for the fact that the Germans destroyed most of Eastern Russia. And they're going to reiterate, or they're going to come up with a formal demand for unconditional surrender in Japan. And at this point, Roosevelt has died, Truman's in charge, and he tells Stalin, I have this new weapon, but he doesn't really say much more than that. He says, I have this great weapon. Now, he doesn't know Stalin actually knows what he's talking about with the atomic weapon. But so if we look at the aftermath of World War II, the two post-war conferences that we talked about kind of set the stage. That's what's supposed to happen after the war. The Soviet Union kind of goes back on a lot of those promises. They continue to occupy and annex a lot of Eastern Europe. And if you look at that picture right here, you can kind of see how the Soviet Union's borders change from 1938, so pre-war. The green lines represent the actual expansion of the Soviet Union. Okay, so they expand a lot of territory. They get part of Germany, which we'll talk about later. But then it also looks at these satellite states, which are basically communist states that are run by the Communist Party in each of those countries, but they're basically called puppet states, and they're essentially run by Stalin. Like, he's in control of what's going on. And Stalin sees this as a buffer zone, these satellite states as a buffer zone between the West, which is democratic, and the East, and him, which is communist. So this is kind of the in-between to protect his country. The U.S. does not like that, so as this group of pink and red countries becomes known as the Eastern Bloc and continues to develop, and it becomes obvious that democracy is not going to happen in those places, the U.S. by early 1946 begins to increasingly distrust Stalin, and we basically think that he's going back on a lot of the smaller promises that he made at Yalta and Potsdam. So it's really important to understand that those two conferences were supposed to set the way the world looked after the war, and what it looks like to President Truman is not what he thought it was supposed to look like. Other thing to keep in mind is that President Roosevelt was the one that started negotiating with Stalin, and he felt like his personal relationship with Stalin, like they got along pretty well, and that he could get Stalin to do stuff just because they got along pretty well, even though he didn't trust Stalin. Truman was only vice president for a few months. He has a high school education. He's new to presidential politics, and he basically just doesn't trust Stalin at all. So Truman comes up with what's known as the Truman Doctrine, which is basically the policy of containment, which is the beginning of the Cold War in 1947. He basically says our U.S. foreign policy is going to be to stop communism from expanding anywhere. So communism, where it is, we're not going to do anything, because militarily we couldn't, it would not have been easy to deal with the Russians because of the size of their army and everything that went with trying to have another war. So we weren't interested in fighting another war. So we just decided that we're going to contain Soviets, and we're not going to let it spread. And that will give rise to conflict in Korea, Vietnam, and a lot of other places. So what does this all mean? What does the actual Cold War look like? We have the Cold War as dates being roughly 1947 to 1991. Okay, so the Cold War goes on and on and on. And when we talk about the Cold War, we're looking at basically a conflict, political conflict, a military conflict that's never direct. Okay, we don't ever actually fight the Soviet Union. We don't go to war with Russia because by 1949 they have atomic weapons, we have atomic weapons. Their military is so large, our military is so large, it probably would have meant the end of the world. So the Cold War is mainly the democracies, the U.S., NATO, and we'll talk about what that means later, and communists, otherwise communities, but mostly communists if you want to take my typo out of context. And that is USSR and the Eastern Bloc allies. And there's no direct fighting, but there's indirect fighting in places like Korea, Nicaragua, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Cuban Missile Crisis. There's all these indirect conflicts, and there's all this almost fighting. There's a lot of times we come close to fighting them. There's a lot of tension between the two sides. There's a large military buildup, and it's really this conflict between ideologies and communism and capitalism. And so what we're going to be looking at is those specific conflicts. How do they affect us? How do they affect the world? We won't be able to touch on everything that happens in 1947 to 1991, but we'll touch on 5 or 6 of the major ones. So if you haven't taken good notes, you need to go back through and do this, watch this presentation again and take notes. You also need to write down the 5 W's, the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, for the Cold War.